Good afternoon. This is Uncle Thor. I was asked if I would discuss the idea of looking at the past of heathenism and its place in the future. And it's a very interesting topic. Now, I'm not a reconstructionist. I don't believe in trying to rebuild the past today exactly as it was. I don't think that can be done. Some say I'm a modernist, some say I'm a futurist. I'm basically very pragmatic about the fact that for heathenism to be a thriving religion, it has to be ready to live in these times. A lot of time has elapsed since the last heathen cultures in Europe froze, stopped, and heathenism itself stopped. And in the interim, humanity has marched on. The irony to all this is that humanity and our society has marched on to a point that the churches didn't want it to go. They didn't want democracy. They wanted a nobility to stay in power. They didn't want women to vote. They wanted to control us. And in spite of that, we now have secular states that operate in spite of the church, which makes us wonder who was running the helm? Who was at the helm during that time? Could it have been our gods working anonymously? We don't know at this time. It's a nice thought. But the other nice thought to go back is, what point does the past of heathenism, what does it even have to do with this day and age? Come on, bunch of old dead Vikings, bunch of ancient Germans, fragments, little statues, little stories. What does it have to do with today? Aha. Let's take a look at something. Let's think of our progress as heathens and as people, part of the greater society, as a forward march, a forward move, if you will. One of the forward in time, moving forward in history. That forward edge of society evolving into the future. Well, if it's a journey, we have to ask ourselves something. How we know where we're going? Using the analogy of a journey, there's usually two things you do if you're doing it by dead reckoning. You have a landmark that you're going toward, or a landmark you can look back at that you're coming from, and this way you can judge which way you're going. Well, moving through time, and Mr. Einstein confirms this, we really don't have a future aiming point. We just have a general direction we're moving. We do not have that landmark. But turning around the other way, in the past, we have the past landmark, the past distant aiming point. That's an Army term, by the way. And that distant aiming point, we can look back when needed to get a fix on where we are now and how we can adjust to go where we think we should be going. So this is an important thing. Whoops, here comes the cat. So this is an important thing. I got to move the cat here. To consider that the past of heathenism and its relevance to today is that distant aiming point, is that reckoning, that positioning, that one solid anchor. Now you'd wonder how a bunch of fragments and half understood stories would be a solid anchor, but think about it, it is. It's the one set of facts, that one tradition. It's like a big Odal rune sitting there saying, here I am, use me to get a fix on your position. Now we'll get into all those fragments and half understood stories in a few minutes. But we need to take a look at where we're going. We talk about society evolving. We talk about, a lot of people like to glorify the Viking Age. That's not the only heathenism there is. The Nederlander, they had their brand of heathenism. The Standard Nederlander and the Frieslander, who are sort of half Nederlander, half German, they're in that area there, had their version of it. The Bayerner had their version of it. Up north, in what is now Mecklenburg, had theirs. Schleswig-Holstein, Denmark, we know some of this from Saxo Grammaticus. Scandinavia, Norway, and Iceland, of course, is because of the Eddas, which are among the few actually written sources we have, because we were never a scriptural religion. It would be different in Sweden, parts of the Baltic, other parts of Germany, other parts of what was then the civilized heathen world. All different. So the Viking Age isn't the only place we got to be looking for. And again, all evolving since that time. Keep in mind, the Viking Age ended because of social and economic and military conditions. Less than 100 years later, the same Viking ships that were so terrifying couldn't hold a candle to the medieval, I think it's called a cask or a cark. It's a boat with a couple little fortifications on it when they hit Bergen Harbor. Things changed. The Viking Age was no longer sustainable. But several hundred years earlier, things changed so that the migration era was no longer sustainable either. So let's keep a perspective on history. Societies evolve, and again, the query about ours, the strange question, how did ours evolve to where we are in spite of the churches? But we did. Now, to give you an idea of the differences in time and such, I'd like you to think back. Let's pick an era we all know, 1974-75. The Nixon hearings, the gas crisis. But, enough movies and films people have seen, even the young kids, to know what things looked like then, before cell phones, computers, beepers, and such. And let's say we take ourselves a guy from right at the start of the Viking Age and drop him in Times Square. Aha. And he's looking at everything, and how is he going to interpret what he sees? How is he going to understand what's around him? He has no parameters for this. He sees a taxi cab going. To him, all vehicles have to be either pushed by people or animals. And what if he gets down into that subway station? He's going to think, what, the Midgard serpent or something? What would he make of a subway or a helicopter or an airplane? What would he make of TV screens, of just the great amounts of glass all over the place and shiny metal, of the grand towers, of the electric lights? If he saw a telephone, a payphone, he might say, yes, a woman went up, put in a coin, grabbed this club, I think it was made of something like bone, and it had a steel wire to the box, and she talked into it. Maybe she was talking to her gods. He wouldn't have these parameters for understanding. And that's how different it was from then to now, because there are so many things that have happened in the interim. If we bring the past back wholesale, we just become reenactors or an anachronism. And that's fine, that's very entertaining, but it doesn't get anything done in this day and age. We have to look at the past of heathenism and bring it into this age and bring its principles where we can use them best. And there's a lot of advantages to it. First of all, it's unvarnished. It's uncorrupted by Christian thought, by monotheistic thought, and some of the other philosophies that have merged since then. And because heathenism was a very down-to-earth, practical way of looking, itself, even in its day, unvarnished. Not a lot of philosophizing or nonsense. They were pretty much calling them as they saw them. That's what we need for the future. But again, how do we bring this into the future, and what are we bringing? Now, I've talked about this in my books, Heathenism for Thinkers, Heathenism for Adults, and I've done a couple videos, Future Heathenism and such. No need for me to rehash it here. Let me ask you this. What is it that is bringing us into the future that is our distant aiming point? Let's get clear on what this thing is. At the outset, it looks like a fragment, a bunch of bits and pieces of very different beliefs with some similar names. It's what it looks like, but don't be fooled. We do have some writings, the Eddas, Grammaticus, a few other accounts, unreliable accounts, but we still have these accounts. But the rest of it, what do we have? We have a lot of fragments. We have a lot of gods that seem the same but have very different names and sometimes very different attributes. In fact, what's head god in one place is a minor deity in another. Tyr was a main deity in some places. He was considered the original god at one time in part of Sweden. And yet, in the Eddas, he's just one of the pantheon. You know, maybe not so in England, where Tyr and Odin were called on together, and that old prayer still exists, or vestiges of it. A place in Hawick, which is in Scotland now, that the Vikings civilized, or maybe the Anglo-Saxons civilized it, but that's where it comes from. So what are these bits and pieces and fragments? What do we even have here? We were never a scriptural religion because everybody knew it. There was no need writing it down. Everyone knew. That's why the Wayland the Smith story from England is gone. No one ever wrote it down because they figure everybody knows. They didn't think times would change. And we're looking at this mass of odds and ends and fragments, and you're saying, it's like a dust heap. What is it? But it's not a dust heap. Because let's look at it again from another perspective. Let's look a little deeper. Now, the gods and goddesses, no matter where we find them, are usually identifiable. The names may be different, some of the attributes are different, but there's enough there to tell us, hey, this deity here is the same as this deity here, and the same one that the Anglo-Saxons had. So we see a cohesion there. There are some deities that are in one place and nowhere else, and that's common anywhere. But we're starting to see a cohesion. We're starting to see that this dust heap isn't a dust heap at all, but it's a very nicely woven quilt of very many different pieces, but the pieces are all together. They're all part of it. We look at Odin. And in Norway and in Iceland, he's called Odin. Sometimes they call him Odd. You know, we have all the nicknames for him. But then he's called Woden by the Anglo-Saxons. Some Germans say Wotan or Vot. And yet, some say he's the head of the pantheon. Some say he's just a god of wizardry. But no matter what they say he is, he's always pretty much the same guy, isn't he? And this across a space of several hundred years and a couple thousand miles. You know, from England to the far reaches of wherever the Goths got to. It's still the same Odin, different name, a few different attributes, different standing in the pantheon, but he's still there. Frigga is still there. Whether she's down in Germany confusing the Germans, I think the one is she moved Odin's bed around or something, so he'd favor one group of Germans over another. I don't know what you want to do that for, but it's still the same as in Scandinavia, Anglo-Saxon England. Again, we look at Father Tyr. In one place in Sweden, he's the original god. Whoa, that's pretty cool. In the Eddas, he's just one of the pantheon. Some German tribes, he's the main some god, and sometimes it's a duality between him and Odin. But it's still Tyr, with the same attributes. And here's the eerie thing. So often in so many places depicted with that one missing hand. Now, I don't know if they all had the same Fenris myth, but they all had something. So what the point I'm getting at is that we're not seeing as much diversity as we think. We're seeing a lot of cohesion. This isn't the kind of precise cohesion that you can measure with numbers and mathematics. This is more the looser type of cohesion, just like the old system of measurement. Nowadays they use the metric, and everything's to the millimeter and in hundredths, you know, and the French and the Heineke and the Swedes use that. But here in America, we still use the oldest style of measuring based on 12. And the reason it's based on that is you can halve it, you could divide it in thirds, you could double it, you could triple it, quadruple it, 12 and 8 are very significant numbers for that, because to use the metric, you always have to have a measuring implement marked out precisely. But to use the old natural measurement, you just have to have one measurement standard, and you could figure everything out by doubling it, halving it, and such. It's a different kind of precision, and in many ways a much more practical way of thinking. If you got to measure something on the fly, you get a ballpark figure. I like using it. But it's that same thinking that underlies heathenism. Not this precise, scholarly, well, this God has this, so he must be this, blow it out your ass. It's more a felt reckoning. It doesn't have that pinpoint precision. There's what we call wiggle room to allow for variations for the needs of different regions and different peoples at different times. So when you're looking back, you're not seeing a dust heap of fragments. You're seeing a great quilt. And though the elements may have different names, each one is still made of the same material. So if you're calling it Tyr or Tivar or Tew, whether you're seeing them in Anglo-Saxon England or Sweden or Bavaria, it's still the same material, that Tyr material. Whether you're seeing Thor in Scandinavia, Thunor in England, Donar in Germany, different names, but it's the same Thor material. There is cohesion. And I got you to it in a roundabout way, and some of you, especially those towards Reconstruction, thinking maybe you've gotten a little pissed off about the way, but we come to the same conclusion. The heathenism of old, though diverse, was heathenism, not heathenisms. And the similarity of the elements certainly far outweighs the differences. And this is our distant aiming point, that we can look to the past and say, that's where we were, that is our anchor, that is the point, that Odal rune, like a great beacon from which we can guide our progress into the future. This is Uncle Thor. Have a good one. I'm signing out.